The late afternoon sun cast long, golden fingers across Willow Creek Lane, painting the tranquil suburban street in hues of warmth and peace. From a distance, the scene was a portrait of American serenity. Manicured lawns were bordered by neat picket fences, and the air was filled with the gentle hush of a community winding down its day. But nestled behind one particular cracked walkway, on a porch with peeling white paint, that profound silence was violently torn apart by a sob. It was a sound so fragile and choked with anguish, it might have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves in a lonely wind. A small boy stood there, his tiny hands desperately clutching a well-loved, slightly tattered stuffed lion. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, were red-rimmed and swollen with tears that carved glistening tracks through the grime on his cheeks. His voice, a mere tremor, sliced through the quietude. "He hurt my grandma," he whispered into the cooling air, and those 4 simple words were laden with enough agony to crack the very foundation of the peaceful world around him. If you hold the conviction that no child should ever have to utter such words from a place of terror, and if you believe that the enduring forces of courage and kindness possess the power to reshape lives, we invite you to connect with our mission. Please take a moment to like this video, comment with your thoughts, share it with others, and subscribe to the Empathy Echo. Here, we strive to remind the world that true strength is not found in dominance, but in the profound power of compassion. The boy's name was Leo, a tender 6 years of age. His oversized blue hoodie was smeared with dirt and dust from a frantic tumble he'd taken down the porch steps just moments before. Behind him, slumped weakly on the top step, was his grandmother, Eleanor. Her favorite lilac dress was ripped at the shoulder, and a deep, ugly bruise was already beginning to blossom across her cheekbone, a violent stain against her pale skin. She cradled her arm against her chest, her face a mask of pained endurance as she tried to shield her grandson from the severity of her injuries. But the truth of what had transpired could not be hidden, it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Framed in the doorway behind her stood a man, his imposing figure casting a long, ominous shadow. His face was flushed with anger and alcohol, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. He glared down at the small boy, his eyes filled with a venomous rage, as if Leo had just spoken an unforgivable heresy. His name was Marcus. He was not a member of their family, but a man who had drifted into their lives with promises of help and support after Eleanor's husband had passed away a year prior. He had been a friend of her late husband, a familiar face in a time of grief. But his initial offers of assistance had slowly curdled into a campaign of control, his presence bringing not comfort, but a tide of anger, fear, and now, physical pain. That afternoon, Leo had fled the house in a blind panic, his bare feet slapping against the worn wooden floorboards. His small hands were wrapped around the stuffed lion, a gift his grandmother had lovingly stitched for him during brighter, happier times, its button eyes having witnessed a life before Marcus. He didn't have a destination in mind, he only possessed the raw, primal instinct that someone, somewhere, had to help them. His hot tears splashed onto the cold concrete of the front path as he stumbled forward, his small world collapsing around him. And it was in that moment of utter despair that a new sound entered the world. A low, guttural rumble began to build, a deep and thunderous growl of powerful engines that vibrated through the soles of Leo's bare feet. It tore through the neighborhood's manufactured stillness like an approaching thunderstorm. A procession of 7 motorcycles, their chrome parts glinting like silver in the setting sun, rounded the corner. They roared closer and closer, the sound growing into a deafening crescendo, until they came to a halt directly in front of Eleanor's house, forming a formidable line that blocked the street. The man at the head of the formation was impossible to ignore. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard of salt and pepper that framed a weathered face. Intricate tattoos snaked down his arms like ancient maps of forgotten battles. Across the back of his worn leather vest, the words, "Iron Sentinels" were stitched in bold, white letters. Below that, a smaller, more personal patch read, "For the voiceless." His name was Jax, and he was the sort of man whose mere presence commanded attention, silencing idle chatter and stirring something primal and respectful in the air around him. When his gaze fell upon the small, weeping boy huddled by the steps, he immediately cut the engine of his powerful machine. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. He swung a heavy leg over his bike and walked toward the child, his heavy boots making no sound on the pavement. He crouched down, bringing his formidable frame to eye level with the boy. "Hey there, little man," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that was surprisingly gentle, carrying both an innate authority and a disarming warmth. "Tell me what's wrong. What happened?" Leo couldn't form the words at first. His grief and fear were a heavy stone in his throat. Instead, he simply lifted a trembling arm and pointed. His small finger was aimed directly at the porch, at the frail, trembling figure of his grandmother, and then at the menacing man who stood over her, the whiskey bottle still clutched in his hand like a weapon. Jax's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. His eyes, which had been soft with concern, hardened into chips of flint. Deep within him, a familiar and intensely painful memory sparked to life. He had seen this exact brand of cowardly cruelty before, witnessed it in his own home, in his own past, when he was a boy too small and too terrified to do anything but hide and cry. But he was no longer small. He was no longer helpless. And he had sworn a long time ago that no one, not on his watch, would ever make a child cry with that specific kind of terror again. Slowly, deliberately, Jax rose to his full, imposing height. His gaze remained locked on the drunken man on the porch, a silent, unyielding challenge. The rest of his crew, 6 other men clad in the same black leather vests, dismounted their bikes and stood in a silent phalanx behind him. They were a wall of quiet judgment, their collective presence radiating a power that was both intimidating and profoundly still. The neighborhood, once oblivious, was now fully alert. Curtains twitched in windows. Doors creaked open just a crack. A palpable tension settled over Willow Creek Lane. Everyone could feel the imminent shift, the sense that a long overdue reckoning was at hand. Marcus attempted to straighten up, his drunken bravado wavering, caught somewhere between belligerent arrogance and a dawning, primal fear. "This is a private matter." "It's none of your business," he slurred, but his voice lacked conviction, betraying the uncertainty that was rapidly consuming him. Jax didn't bother to respond with words. He simply began to walk forward, his steps calm, steady, and as unstoppable as a rising tide. The last rays of the setting sun caught the polished chrome studs on his vest, making them flash like warning signals. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his boots planted firmly on the cracked concrete, and looked up at Marcus. "It became my business," Jax said, his voice low and quiet, yet it carried with absolute clarity to every watching window and every listening ear. "It became my business the second I heard that little boy say those words." A tremor ran through Marcus's hand. The whiskey bottle lowered slowly, as if it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. His shifty gaze darted from the unblinking eyes of the biker leader to Eleanor, the woman whose trust he had so brutally betrayed, and then to Leo, the child who had been forced to run to complete strangers for the safety he should have provided. His lips quivered, forming the shape of some twisted, pathetic excuse that died before it could ever become sound. In that moment, the unvarnished truth stood before him, not in accusations or threats, but in the solid, unwavering presence of a line of men who, as individuals, may have once been broken themselves, but had since rebuilt their lives into a shield for others. Leo, feeling a sense of safety for the first time in what felt like an eternity, moved to stand behind Jax's legs, still clutching his stuffed lion. From this new vantage point, he watched as the man who had terrorized his grandmother seemed to physically shrink, his towering menace dissolving into something small and pitiful. Jax never raised his voice. He never balled his fists. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of what he and his men represented, justice, protection, an unbreakable brotherhood, was more than enough. He leaned in slightly, his voice remaining calm but now laced with a steely edge that cut through the evening air. "She doesn't require your help any longer," he stated, the words precise and final. "Pack your bags. Get your things. You're done here." Marcus stumbled back a step, then another. His face was a mess of confusion, fear, and impotent rage. He shot one last hateful glare at Eleanor and Leo before turning and blundering back into the house. No one moved to stop him. A few moments later, he emerged, hastily stuffing a set of keys into his pocket. He scrambled into a battered pickup truck parked at the curb and sped away, the squeal of his tires a final, pathetic act of defiance. As the sound of his engine faded into the distance, a profound and genuine peace settled over the house for the first time that day. Only then did Jax turn his attention back to Eleanor. He moved up the steps and knelt again, this time at her side, his large frame seeming to envelop her in a protective aura. She managed a weak, pained smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief. "You didn't have to do all this," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Ma'am," Jax interrupted gently, his voice softening once more. "No one should ever have to live in fear. Not in their own home." He paused, his own voice cracking almost imperceptibly as he glanced at Leo, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes. "Not you. And especially not him." With a subtle nod, he motioned to his men, who moved forward with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They were no longer an intimidating wall of leather and chrome, but a team of gentle guardians. One of them, a burly man with a kind face, produced a bottle of water and offered it to Eleanor. Another, whose vest bore a patch that read "Doc," opened a saddlebag and retrieved a comprehensive first aid kit. The neighbors watched, transfixed, as this group of men, so often stereotyped and judged as dangerous outlaws, displayed more tenderness and organized care than the quiet street had ever witnessed. Doc gently cleaned the cut on Eleanor's face, his large, tattooed hand surprisingly delicate. They spoke to her in low, reassuring tones, asking her questions, making sure she was coherent, and ensuring her immediate safety. One of them had already made a call, and the distant wail of an ambulance was now growing closer. When the paramedics arrived, Jack stayed behind with Leo. He sat on the steps beside the small boy, the two of them watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Jack spoke softly, asking Leo about his lion, about school, about his favorite things. And for the first time that day, a genuine smile bloomed on Leo's face. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was bright enough to make Jax's throat tighten with emotion. As the paramedics carefully helped Eleanor onto a gurney and into the ambulance, Leo suddenly darted over to Jax. He threw his small arms around the biker's leg and hugged him with all his might. "Thank you," he whispered into the worn leather, his voice muffled but clear, still clutching his lion in his other hand. Jax looked down at the top of the boy's head and simply placed a large, gentle hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. When the ambulance had pulled away, its lights flashing silently as it disappeared down the street, the iron sentinels remounted their motorcycles. The quiet returned, but this time it was a peaceful, healing silence. Before starting his engine, Jax took one last look at the little house, at the small boy standing on the porch waving bravely, and at the thought of the old woman who was now, finally, safe. He didn't speak the words aloud, but the sentiment echoed through his very soul. Sometimes, the most profound acts of kindness, the loudest declarations of decency, are performed by those whom the world expects it from the least. He revved his engine once, a powerful roar that echoed down the length of Willow Creek Lane. It was no longer a sound of intimidation or threat, but a promise, a declaration that as long as men like them were riding, kindness would always find its way to where it was needed most. If this story resonated with you, if it served as a reminder that strength and compassion can be found in the most unlikely of heroes, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the Empathy Echo. It is here that we celebrate the truth that real courage often begins with a simple act of kindness. Before you leave, we invite you to comment below. What would you have done if you had heard a child cry those heartbreaking words? Because in the end, it is often the courage of a single person, or a single group, that can change everything.